What does it mean to be a truth teller in catastrophic times? Today, on Homebrewed Christianity, I'm getting to talk with Cornel West about his recent Gifford Lectures, where he brought something unprecedented to one of philosophy's most prestigious platforms. A jazz-soaked philosophy that refuses to reduce catastrophe to manageable problems. From Plato's Republic to Coltrane's Love Supreme, West offers a blueprint for bearing witness when the world feels like it's coming apart. I absolutely love talking to Cornel about this. His lecture series was amazing, and I can't wait for the final version in print to come out. But if you want to check out the lecture series, I will link it on this post. If you, like me, are a bit of a nerd and enjoy every time you get to read or watch and listen to some Gifford Lectures, then check it out. And for those that don't know, the Giffords are a series of lectures that take place in Scotland, and they are kind of like the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for philosophy. And they have a prestigious history, which we'll talk about in here. And if you get the time to listen to Cornel's lectures, you'll see that he is narrating the history of the lectures, the different moves and changes, and then bringing to fore, right, what happens when philosophers start with catastrophe taking place in history, and not the more flattened, sterile, distance approach that is often tempting for philosophers, especially those who aren't yet questioning the privilege and power that they possess. Anyway, it was a blast to talk to Dr. West, and I hope you enjoy it. And if you do, share it with a friend, because the best brew is a shared brew. All right, theology nerds, peace out for now. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and for the first time on the podcast is Cornel West, and super excited to have you here. And it's always fun to get to have a conversation with someone you've just dreamed about your conversations with them. Ever since I read Prophesied Deliverance in divinity school, you've been creeping in my imagination and occasionally my dreams. So,
my God, that Prophesied Deliverance, 1982, 43 years ago, and you were a graduate student probably in about 2005, 2006,
yep,
something like that. But first, I just want to congratulate you for being such a major force, not just for good, but for the kingdom and what you do with Homebrew Christianity, though, brother. The ways in which you've been able to orchestrate these magnificent interviews, and of course, my distinguished colleague who lives right next door to me, and we teach together, Brother Gary and Dorian, when he sings your praises, that's something else. I think he's the greatest Christian ethicist since Reinhold Niebuhr. I really do believe that. And when he sings your praises, he and I break bread as often as we can, then I know that you got a whole lot going on. I'm telling you.
Well, I'm glad he says nice things about me when I'm not around. The last time we were talking, I guess 2 times ago, we were talking, and it was in the middle of when you were giving your Gifford lectures.
Ooh.
And now, when you first came to Edinburgh and they were luring you to give them, I was on faculty there doing science and religion, and so I was all excited. Then we moved back. Our youngest is starting high school. Our oldest is starting high school, and we wanted him to have 4 years in the same place because he'd moved, like, following his academic father.
Absolutely.
So I was setting my alarm to be able to sit there and text with my former friends on or not former friends, former faculty members, as you were giving the lectures, and they were spectacular. And one of the things that struck me about them that I'd love to hear when the form of the lectures came in mind is that the Gifford Lectures, doing natural philosophy, have within it a host of assumptions that you problematize throughout the lecture series. And perhaps the most ardent one is that you start looking at the kind of questions that Giffords raise by talking about our catastrophic times. And the particularity of any moment in history is rarely front of mind for the Giffords, let alone those threads running throughout. And so as someone who has spent so much time with these figures that have given the lecture series and then engaged it in your own work, what is entailed in putting the catastrophic times in our present and catastrophe in general at the beginning of your kind of constructive work?
Well, I appreciate that question, though. No, when I first received the letter, which would have been maybe 2021, I think it was. I remember reading the letter as walking from my office, and then the great Preston Williams and Connie Williams driving right next to me, and I'm showing them the letter. And he, of course, is one of my mentors there, the first black tenured professor at Harvard Divinity School, 1972. Studied with Talcott Parsons at Harvard in the 1950s, and H. Richard Niebuhr with Yale and at the Yale Divinity School. And he was saying, well, what are you going to talk about? I said, well, I've got to have a little talk with Jesus and see how I can best be of use, because it was a question of vocation, it's a question of calling. How can I best bear witness on this international stage to be a truth seeker and a truth teller in light of my own deep commitment to a Christian way of life? And the notion of the catastrophic hit me immediately, because I just felt that we're living in catastrophic times. And how could I attempt to be in conversation with some of the grandest and wisest voices of the past and do it in such a way that it could still have some real relevance and pertinence in our present moment, both at the level of illumination, at the level of execution in terms of deed, and at the level of spiritual formation. And I think all three of those are inseparable, but in no way identical. And so that notion of catastrophic hit me hard. I had a debate in my mind, though, brother, between whether I would wrestle with Chekhov or wrestle with Coltrane. Would it be Socrates the Chekhov or Socrates the Coltrane? Now, if it was Chekhov, there'd still be a whole lot of jazz soap qualities in it. And even it ending up being Coltrane, there was a lot of Chekhov like elements in it. I just didn't tease it out, because Chekhov and Coltrane, for me, are two of the fundamental artistic guiding stars in light of my own fallible and finite and fallen Christian witness.
Yeah, well, one of the things about this challenge you put up front of confronting catastrophe is, and there you dialogue with Plato in the Republic, but also Rosenzweig in the Star of Redemption, and that powerful line of his that you did an extended meditation on, of wrestling with what it means to acknowledge the corpses of history and then responding with solidarity, not denial. In that session, you raise this habit that a lot of philosophers do of looking at the catastrophe of existence, then smashing it down to a few problems so you can then deal with them. Usually we tend to do it in our prolegomena, because then we got to get to the real truth. And going, no. It's that maneuver of taking the catastrophe of existence, making it a problem so you can now dismiss it and get on to your rational reflection that you problematize in like profound ways. And that feels like here's a part I liked, Cornel, statement, not a question, but I'm sorry. I just think that's an important observation to make. And I wonder how you see it show up both in the philosophical discourse and maybe more familiar to us in normal public or in religious discourse.
Yeah, I think in so many ways, though, brother, when you begin with art, it's very much like Gadamer's Truth and Method, which, of course, is my favorite philosophic text of the catastrophic 20th century. And I was blessed to spend good time with him when he taught at Boston College. That, remember, he begins with the experience of truth in the realm of art. And what is it about art? Well, art is not going to reduce catastrophes to problems. It's not going to reduce the catastrophic to the problematic. And once you reduce it to a problem, then you've got managerial strategies, or you've got certain kind of discursive strategies, and you're not really dealing with the ways in which you have been, in some ways, overwhelmed by the catastrophe, and therefore you're really building what, for me, which is a high moment in one of the first great Giffords, William James, Varieties of Religious Experience. You might remember he said that the center of the religious tradition is the call for help. That call for help. You see it in Psalm 46:1. You see it in Psalm 121, right? Help. And then you move to Nathaniel West, Miss Lonely Hearts, that first chapter, which is his rereading of James and Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov in light of his American experience. And it's help. It's very much like Ann Landers. He's responding to people who are writing letters calling for help. I don't have a nose, echoes of Gogol, right? but that's one of the letters, right? My husband left me or whatever it is. Well, see, that call for help is so human, brother, because it cuts against the grain for each and every one of us, no matter what color, sexual orientation, nation, class, national identity, whatever. It's a human thing at the deepest level. And when you start there, you say, well, the catastrophic is not something that you're going to be able to manage. You're looking for how do you cope? What kind of armor do you have? What kind of readiness do you do you have access to? And that's really why, I mean, for me, the blues and jazz become so very important because they are fundamentally about not reducing the catastrophic to a problem, but really how do you wrestle with it? I've heard one of your wonderful sermons talking about, was it Esau and Jacob? Oh, I love that sermon, but I don't know where you were, but you remember preaching that?
Yes.
Genesis 33. You said, oh, but let's go back to 32. Let's go back to 32. Wrestling with the angel of death or God in the midnight hour, emerging with that wound as Israel, which means God wrestler. And what are the ways in which that wrestling with God has becomes a transformative and manifest in your actions and your deeds?
Well, one of the parallels of your lecture series and the kind of kickoff of the American Age of Niebuhr's is world events were happening while you were giving them.
Yeah.
And so not only was I, looking at, watching videos of a room, I've gone to plenty of lectures while I was in Edinburgh, but there are videos coming up of you joining protest over Israel and Israel's invasion into Palestine in response to October 7th, and the kind of cultural tensions that are there, and then naming it and bringing it into a lecture series of dealing with catastrophe. And there is, that was a year ago, and it's still going on.
Yeah.
And it seems as if maybe a week or two ago, a few more mainstream Democrats got a text message that said, perhaps now we could acknowledge that starving people's not good, or something like that, where there's like a kind of little more openness. But I wonder how you see that bloody bench of human history that you talk about in the lecture of Hegel's, adding up unnecessary kill counts, while those who pretend to be stewards of a wise and humane civilization remain deaf to the cries of children starving. Like that is like such a palpable catastrophe of this moment that problematizes so much of our normal high-minded discourse, be it among our peers in the academy or in the public square.
No, that's a wonderful question, though, brother. And you are absolutely right. You remember when Niebuhr was giving his lectures on the nature and destiny of man in Edinburgh. And in those days, of course, he stayed much, much longer. He had a whole year that they could actually hear and see bombs being dropped in that barbaric Second World War, where millions and millions and millions and millions of precious human beings all around the world would die. And it just so happened that when I was asked, and of course, I'm also in the midst of a presidential campaign, so that I had to take time off from the campaign to give the Gifford lectures. And the campaign is about, trying to speak the truth through the forms of catastrophe in the American empire and trying to reintroduce the country to the best of the American empire, which for me is Martin King and a whole Rabbi Heschel and Edward Said, Dorothy Day, and a host of others. Miles Horton would be a good example too. I mean, there's so many persons who constitute the best of the empire. And then to be asked to come from the U.S. empire, who was facilitating and enabling a genocide in real time, ethnic cleansing in real time, and supporting an apartheid like regime in real time, and to have voices on the street in demonstrations and so forth asking me to be a part of it. I said, oh my God, I'd already done the same thing in the States. And it was a beautiful thing to be able to raise my voice and try to cast some kind of light on the suffering of so many precious human beings, especially precious innocent civilians, especially children, especially children. What was it, 65, 70% of those who were killed then at now are children. You see, so we're really talking about something that is, again, it's beyond description, man. We don't have a language for this kind of thing, and yet it continues to go on to this very day. And of course, recently, Netanyahu has announced that he wants a more barbaric occupation of Gaza, which includes more innocent people being killed, a deepening of the genocide, and yet nobody has the power to stop it. The United States has the power to do it. Biden didn't do it. Trump's not doing it. And so we have to try to get people raising their voices. And raising our voices, we have to try to do it in such a way, though, brother, that we're not self righteous. You see, I really don't believe in Manichaeanism. You remember Augustine had to outgrow that and lays it out in the Confessions with tremendous power. So it's not as if it's just all good on one side and all evil on the other. No, it's not. Life is not like that. There's structures of domination with asymmetric relations of power, and yet as human beings on both sides. So that all the speeches I would give, I would always stress a precious Palestinian baby has the same value as a precious Israeli baby. A precious white baby in North Carolina has the same value as a precious black baby in Mississippi, and so forth and so on. That is part of our Christian witness, which means that it will get you in trouble because it's not about isms. It's about virtues, faith, hope, and love. There's a wonderful line that George MacDonald has, which said, God is not interested in isolated truths and orphaned deeds. C.S. Lewis uses this in one of his anthologies of this. And it's true. God is interested in decent, good human beings who are willing to choose his will and have enough courage to follow through and act on his will. So you shall know them by their fruits. What is it about these Christians? They're the ones who's running around loving these people. Really, it makes no sense. It's not supposed to make sense. It's foolish. It's supposed to be foolish in the eyes of the world. That's why I spent so much time on Erasmus in Praise of Folly, right? Go and building on Sebastian Brandt's wonderful text of 1492 on Ship of Fools. We're all on this ship. We got all these different kind of fools. We're wretched human beings, so we shouldn't be surprised by evil or paralyzed by despair. This evil that we see, this slaughter, the moment of the slaughter bench of history that Hegel talked about, Gaza is one moment. Sudan's another. Haiti's another. Poor folk in North Carolina is another. Domestic violence is another. Trashing of precious trans is another. There's so many different forms of of evil that are out there that we shouldn't be overwhelmed by it, but we should be fortified enough. And I keep coming back to fortified, which I know is not a Christian virtue; it's a pagan virtue, especially more in Rome than Greece, actually. But it's a strength of character. Aristotle would call it magnanimity. Well, there's that we Christians need strength of character. We got too many cowardly Christians. You got too many Christians who are conformists. And somewhere I read, "Be ye not conform, but transform." Well, that's not just words that on the text. That's supposed to be part of your witness because Christianity is about a way of life. We didn't have to read Pierre Hadot to know that philosophy and love of wisdom is a way of life. We learned that already from the blood at the cross. This is the way of love of those who build on this particular Palestinian Jew who was killed by the Roman Empire and told us to love God and love ye one another and love your enemies. That really gets you in trouble. That make absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's not supposed to.
Yep. Yeah. That you pick up that Kierkegaardian key about the kind of the challenge of Christ to submit to our reason and reflection in the lectures quite well.
No, but see, your invocation to Kierkegaard is right on time and hits the nail on the head, because I've been a card carrying Kierkegaardian since I was 14 years old, living way out in Glen Eldon on the chocolate side with the bookmobile. Didn't have access too much to the library, but that bookmobile had Kierkegaard's journals. And I'd read biographies of Albert Einstein and so other texts that I love. But when I read that, I said, my God, this is deeper than Sunday school and vacation Bible school in terms of what's going on. And we had some really magnificent teachers, Mrs. Sarah Ray and others who taught me, especially Book of Job and Book of Ecclesiastes. But Kierkegaard just took it to a whole new level. You remember Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was probably the most creative and original philosopher of the 20th century in the West. He said Kierkegaard was the most profound thinker of the 19th century. And Wittgenstein was not a Christian, as you know. He was deeply influenced by Christian sensibilities, very much like Chekhov. But he said it was too beautiful to believe, the way George Santayana used to say, it's just too beautiful to believe. Sunday morning, it's just the story. It's so powerful. The Eucharist hits hard. It couldn't be true, because the world we live in is just so contrary to the intervention of this kind of beauty. And you say, we understand, yes, there is a beauty to the story, but there is deep truths as well. So the Wittgenstein's relation to Kierkegaard, and you know who else was out with Kafka? You remember Kafka reads Kierkegaard and says, I finally read someone who understands me. This is our Jewish brother from Prague, one of the great literary figures of the 20th century, who I mentioned just briefly in the lecture. I think the Metamorphosis is one of the things that I touch on briefly. But you're right about Kierkegaard. But see, what a lot of people don't get in Kierkegaard that you understand is the text that he wrote his name, not the pseudonym, Works of Love, one of them. And that bears rereading at least once a year.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful book.
Oh man!
So you found Kierkegaard as around 8th grade.
That's
Sounds
true.
like
that's true.
And I had parents with a very big library, and if I asked good questions, they gave me a book and were like, after you read this, we'll talk to you about it.
Ooh.
And I was handed Sickness Unto Death in middle school, and this is one of the things about Kierkegaard is, I don't know if I understood everything that happened in that book at all, but I knew I wanted to.
Yes.
Because unlike some philosophers, his passion for life is palpable all the time. And when you mention his journals, anytime I get to teach him, I'll always start with the journals, because he sounds just like a college student becoming aware, where he realizes, I found myself in the world, and where I happened to be born meant I learned language from these people, which is this language from this moment in time, and now all the world becomes interpreted, and yet I'm part of a group that created that whole thing. And could the thing in itself really be just like am I just like a historical accident that I came with language organizing all of existence there? Like, who am I in this? They have all these stories about my finitude and where I go, and like
That's right.
He's sitting there with this moment right as kind of historical consciousness and such emerges, and there's this temptation. You in the lecture series, you use the Vico versus Hobbes to play this out, but this sense that when we look at history, there's this temptation to either be a bystander to it and let all the inertia of where you found yourself in the world tell you who you are and what you can be, or go, oh, it is historically constructed, and I can render my life otherwise. I can seize my finitude and pour it into my neighbor and these kinds of things. And that was one of the elements of the lecture series that I was watching it live that touched me, and then re-listening to it this past week is that the way in which the emergence of historical consciousness for the larger Western tradition actually has the potential of re-energizing the prophetic in the biblical traditions to new layers of complexity that we didn't have before. It connects to some of your early work, and so I'd love for you to kind of just unpack the what historical consciousness meant, right, when it kind of comes online as something we spectate, like you can see in Kierkegaard's journal, to then something, if we have that existential seizure that Kierkegaard has, where we're not just subject to historical consciousness. We could prophesy otherwise. We can improv the lines we were handed. That kind of energy that kind of runs through the lectures.
Oh no, that's eloquently put, my dear brother. Eloquently put. I mean, I think one of the things that Kierkegaard understood was that it's impossible to go through life from womb to tomb and be a spectator. Hamlet tried to. In relation to York, he couldn't do it. He pulled it off with Ophelia. In relation to his Gertrude, his mother, he couldn't do it, but he still suffers from the underdeveloped capacity to love. Now, Kierkegaard understood that love was precisely that alluring, yet in some way absurd reality, which is the most powerful force in one's life, both as need and as gift and as task, or as need, deed, and seed. Either one, either lineage will suck you into being a participant. So that's where the existential and what would later be a kind of live reality that Dilthey would talk about, building on one or liveness that's first found in a letter that Hegel wrote. Hegel didn't build on it, but Wilhelm Dilthey does. And it becomes almost Kierkegaardian, even though it appears after Kierkegaard dies. And I think you're so right that when you're young, and you've been able to go through life and you got your own traditions, you had your families wrestling with all kind of strife and conflict, you got your own sexual challenges and what have you, and you recognize, my God, I can't be a spectator. How can I be honest, candid? You see, historical consciousness, and it's not, I mean, we can go back in the West to Thucydides. I mean, a favorite of Nietzsche. Nietzsche says read Thucydides rather than Plato if you really want a sense of life, because it's the history that's important. Though we know he had a love-hate relation with Socrates, rendered in Plato's text, but he liked the Socrates of Xenophon more than he liked the Socrates of Plato. But history is a matter of forcing us to be honest. Historical consciousness forces us to be candid about our formation. So no matter how participatory we are, we're going to be shaped and molded by something bigger than ourselves, which are historical forces, which are social forces. Now, in the last 20 or 30 years, when people think of history, they primarily think of race or gender or class or empire. And those are very, very important factors, but there's a whole host of factors that are out there that are psychic, that are spiritual, that are cultural, that cut deeper than a race or gender or class or empire. So it's not a question of eliminating them, but just being honest about all of the different factors that go into the shaping of who we are. And historical consciousness for me has always been the starting point. When Frederick Jameson talks about always historicize, always contextualize, and it's partly also always dramatize. And it's no accident that the great philosophers, let alone the great theologians, most of them were dramatists. You go back to Hugh of St. Victor and his reflections on Noah's Ark, those three powerful texts that he writes on Noah's Ark, the flood being inside, the flood outside, those outside the ark, those inside the ark, and so on. It's powerful drama. And what is drama? Conflict emotionally felt and critically reflected upon as you continue, like 32nd chapter of Genesis again, to emerge, grow, develop, mature, or regress, fall back. I mean, maturity is not built in. These are choices you have to make. And Kierkegaard, of course, is one of the greatest dramatic thinkers, I think, of all of modernity. Nietzsche's the only one to come close. Dostoevsky is quite explicitly a dramatic novelist, so I could tell some lies in order to reveal some truths. I mean, that's what he can do in his five great novels: The Idiot, Crime and Punishment, Brothers Karamazov, and others. So that I'm with you though, brother. I love your idea of starting with the journals. That has never ever occurred to me. It took me a long time to teach Kierkegaard, and I've never taught Chekhov, and I've never taught Coltrane because it's just too close. It's like teaching mom.
It's dangerous.
It's in my skin. I say, oh, it's a little bit too much. But the idea of actually starting with the journals. But that's not true. I did teach Kierkegaard at Union back in the 70s, early on. We did some philosophical fragments of unconcluding scientific postscript. But usually, when texts are that close to you, oh my God, it's very difficult.
Well, what's funny, what occasioned it was their faculty had switched over when I was in Edinburgh, and they were like, "Oh, can you do the philosophy of religion class?" And as someone who's primarily a continental philosopher, I'm perfectly capable. And the idea of spending 3 months on the arguments for or against the existence of God and having to grade 40 papers on the Kalam argument, not exciting. So I said, "Well, I said, can we spend about the same time with the continental tradition?" And they said yes. And so I'm 3 lectures in when lockdown happens for COVID.
Ooh.
And so when we get to the continental side, all of a sudden you're sitting there going, am I about to teach analytic philosophers continental philosophy with pre-recorded lectures on Zoom? This is going to go bad. So I switched up the order to do Kierkegaard and use the journals, because he is asking questions of significance about his own finitude that a syllogism is an offense to, right? And yet all of them, I thought I was going to get to do my master's in Scotland, and now I'm at home in my parents' basement doing Zoom classes. So like it turned into this thing where if one of the philosophical canon asks the most basic questions of being human, and I said, yeah. And so the continental tradition looks at the analytic and goes, y'all can have your logistical arguments about God, and we have questions ever since Hume about this that are hard to get over. But we do know material reality involves religious people, traditions, and texts.
Oh, absolutely.
So we're going to think about those, and we're going to talk about that. And I found it so helpful because Kierkegaard, who you can't mistake the guy's a Christian, had post-religious people or people of other faiths finding shared passion with his questions. Yeah. And I think it's that philosophers don't want things to be off the table when we talk about them, but we only talk about what we allow to get on the table. Mm-hmm. And that historical consciousness thread in your lecture series is always woven with this ongoing critique of power. And I think one of the things I said when I was talking to my senior in high school son about getting to talk to you, trying to explain how cool Cornel West is.
And that can be difficult. Now that can be difficult, my brother.
Well, you can grade it. I said, we understand ourselves. We have historical consciousness, but not all people incorporate a critique of power. And then there are those that critique power that aren't aware of historical consciousness. And what Cornel West does is kind of invites us to recognize that the story of civilization is a story of power, and the beauty and tragedy of it waxes and wanes. And what the philosopher is inviting not just their peers to do, but to us as individuals, our communities and collectives, is to with integrity take responsibility for what we bring and give to the world, and with generosity receive what others give back. And it's in that space that you can have someone get up, I'm sure a number of faculty awkward by naming the catastrophes that are going on in the present, but that didn't stop you from naming the children on both sides. And it doesn't stop us from naming the conflicts where our military industrial complex isn't making money, so we just ignore them altogether, right? Like you start going through the list. And to me, it's that being able to look at the story of civilization and take responsibility for your place in it without legitimating or whitewashing or deodorizing, one of the lines you like to use, the stench of it, right? It's
Yes,
that
yes,
the Walter Benjamin's angel
yes.
of history,
That's right.
and that you are moving forward, but you're not ignoring the corpses that are behind you, and so you walk with intentionality.
Brother, you got it. You broke that down in a very lucid, succinct, and compelling way. You got it. The only emendation I would have is that I would not want to ever use just power
Uh-huh.
in the singular. You see, we that there's always varieties of power and
Mm-hmm.
forms of power. There's political power and economic power. With economic power, you're going to need a serious analysis in the last 400 years of capitalism. It's been the major mode of production that has helped make and reshape the world. And with its asymmetric relations of power at the workplace, its obsession with profit and so forth, so that it allowed the channeling of organized greed, which is something you find in any empire, any nation
Mm-hmm.
state, any social life. But economic power is different than spiritual power. It's different than cultural power. It's different than political power. So there's always variety of different
Mm-hmm.
kinds of power, and some of them are reinforce, hegemonic rule. Some of them are counter hegemonic in terms of resistance. Same is true with tradition. People think they somehow are going to transcend tradition. No, you're just going to end up with a tradition of the new. The question is not whether you have a tradition. The question is which one. You can have a traditionalist conception of tradition that tends to be pro status quo. You can have a tradition of resistance against hegemonic traditions, but it's still a tradition because you're still in time, you're still in space, and you still have to come to terms with antecedent practices that shape and mold you. So, in that sense, I think it's profoundly Christian in this way. You remember what Nietzsche said about Christianity? He said, Christianity taught me the love to truth. And I reached the conclusion that Christianity was not true. And therefore, it was what I learned from Christianity that led me to reject Christianity. That's a certain kind of tribute to Christianity, even though I reject his conclusion, right? So there's no Nietzsche without a Christian soil in that sense. We know that now. I had no doubt about that. But on the other hand, for those of us who are fundamentally committed to the truth and believe that Jesus is the fleshification of the truth, then we should embrace historical consciousness in all of its forms and all of the different kinds of power that are out there. And those forms of power can generate levels of domination and oppression and social misery, or they can generate ecstasy and bliss and joy, a joy that especially goes hand in hand with love, but not exclusively, but especially go hand in hand with love and connects, the concerns about the beautiful as well as the good to that truth. And that's, as you know, was very much also what those Gifford lectures were about. And so people were wondering, well, he's talking about these canonical texts of the West. Does that mean somehow that he's deeply politically conservative? No, not at all. These canonical texts don't belong to anybody, which is to say, they belong to everybody.
You mentioned Gadamer earlier, who in your love of him, I didn't know you got to hang out with him, which is really
Oh
cool.
yeah, that was
But
something.
I think you do a beautiful job of doing tradition how Gadamer describes it, right? That they if you look at the problems we're facing, and this is that kind of shallow nihilism that you're critical of in the lecture series, and you go, well, civilization and the tradition brought us all this ugly stuff, so let's just chuck it. Then Gadamer's like, well, a tradition, one of the gifts it gives is that it's a live, living conversation and you get to enact it.
That's right.
It also means that you have a whole narrative and conversation and stories and frameworks and rituals and rhythms for reflecting on it. And the other thing a tradition is, it's supposed to be questioned, but you only get to ask a question at a time. You can't question the whole thing and then let the power of it open up. And so what you did in the lecture series, right, is to ask the natural philosophy question of kind of the Anglo-American philosophical question, and then said, well, I want to tell the story with a part of the tradition that hasn't been voiced. I want to sing the blue note in this story. I want to say that I want to reintroduce the swing. I want to ask for improvisation, right, which is reintroducing the tradition in a different orientation. So it's simultaneously an inheritance and an evolution. And I think that dynamism of recognizing that there's that by wrestling within the tradition against it for its own flourishing is a kind of fidelity, pure repetition, or just sweeping dismissal can't muster.
No, that's true, especially if we're going to intervene and be forces for the kingdom, forces for the beloved community, or what Coltrane would call forces for good, for those who are suffering. So that phronesis, has a tremendous gravitas. It's not just practical wisdom in the abstract. It's not just practical judgments in the abstract, but they are forms of living, forms of life, forms of existing that execute deeds to try to opt in the language of my own Reverend Willie P. Cook, who baptized me when I was 7 years old. I just smile when I think about it. He's at Brookhaven, Mississippi. He said, "You've chosen a way of helpfulness. Everywhere you go, you go help somebody." In fact, you might remember even in Edinburgh, I talk about the kingdom of God is within you, and everywhere you go, you're going to leave some heaven behind. They going to know that you have a relationship with a Jesus of Nazareth because that spirit is at work in you. And I believe that. In that sense, I'm a literalist, and that's different than being a fundamentalist, brother, sister, who, calling for infallibility in their own way. What is it, 1870? Our Catholic brothers and sisters opted for papal infallibility. And then a little bit later, our deeply Protestant brothers and sisters opted for scriptural infallibility. You say, oh, wait a minute. I was under the impression that we were cracked vessels. And if we crack
Yeah.
vessels, the fallibility cuts across the board. So no matter what the status of the scripture is, our readings will be fallible. There's no doubt about that. And of course, the scholarship and such means you're going to have to contextualize even the scriptural texts themselves. But it has everything to do with ensuring that you are a participant, an agent, a free agent, making choices under circumstances not of your own choosing. And therefore, every attempt to dismiss the tradition is itself a moment of the tradition. I mean, there's no escape in that regard. It really is.
I mean, I never thought of doing it this way, but in the lecture series, there are these core convictions or callings that are cruciform in shape.
Yeah.
Kenosis, kinesis, kairos. You got three different Greek words with a K. Just the posture in which you took in introducing them, is to an audience where there are inheritors of the West who are uncomfortable with the notes that it requires a cross to sing. And through the blues and the jazz soaked philosophy, and then these echoing of the cruciform life, you introduce kairos, kenosis, kinesis back in it. And I'd love for you to kind of unpack how those three concepts came to shape such a part of it, and perhaps how, as a public intellectual, a philosopher, and a Christian, why introduce the gift of the Jesus story in that way in the conversation?
Mm-hmm. No, indeed, indeed. Well, for me, it has everything to do with what I started with in those lectures, which is Beruf, which is vocation. And a reflection on, Max Weber's two great essays of 1917 and 1919, Science as Vocation, Politics as Vocation, because a sense of one's calling, which is an existential question. It has other dimensions, but it's an existential question. God, what is Brother Tripp with his magnificent family? Is your wife's name Alicia?
Yep.
And the three precious children?
Elgin, Cora, and Haven.
Yes. What is he and they called to do at this particular moment, right? And it does have a consistency and recurrency, but what is the calling? Well, the calling then has something to do with this sense of how does one love others? Going back to Philippians, how does one empty oneself? How does one sacrifice oneself? What is one willing to give up in order to be true to one's calling? Now, already that's going to pit you against most of the market culture because the market
Well, it
culture,
is Jesus's only either or, is God or mammon.
that's
And
right.
then
That's
the church has
exactly right.
spent 2,000 years muting that passage.
That's precisely right, though, brother. But that kenosis, that emptying out, does go hand in hand with how you're able to sustain yourself. That's where the kinesis comes in. To sustain your vocation over space and time, over decades, and luckily, over a half century now. In my case, almost. So that's nothing but a blessing there, though, brother. But then the kairos, which has to do with, okay, now how do you understand the meaningfulness of this particular moment that's separated from flattened out time, which is chronos, which is routinized time, which is chronos. And so all three of those K's go hand in hand with this notion of a particular kind of calling. And you might recall, I mean, I begin by invoking this wonderful footnote of Weber in one of the Vocation lectures, which is a poem by Goethe called Daimon. And he's reflecting on the daimon that Socrates had. And most analytical philosophers don't like to talk about that side of Socrates. No, he's supposed to be a rationalist through and through. Even Nietzsche's got Socrates as a rationalist in Birth of Tragedy, right? You say, wait a minute, Friedrich. Nietzsche is a religious man. This cat's hearing voices, and he takes them very seriously. That's why he goes to the Delphic Oracle and accepts it. He doesn't interrogate the oracle itself. No, he's got a calling. And Goethe understood that, and Weber brings that powerful poem of Goethe into his own conception of calling, even though Weber himself, as a German and a Prussian, is much more concerned about Luther and Calvin conception of Beirut, but it can go all the way back, even to the Greeks, even to the Romans, and so forth. I mean, one of the major limitations, and there's so many of my Gifford lectures, was that I am so very much preoccupied with the conversation within the West as a chocolate brother, as a black man who have been shaped on the bottom of the West. Or I'm also obsessed with modernity in all of its various forms, uh, uh, political, economic, intellectual, existential, religious, and secular, and so on. But from the bottom of modernity, the enslaved, the Jim Crow, the lynched, and so forth and so on. That doesn't mean I have access to any automatic truth, because there's a whole history of lies and crimes of all groups, just like there's a history of gangsters and thugs and knaves and thieves of all groups. But those who choose a certain lens may end up seeing things that a lot of the others have not. I mean, I was blessed to engage in a massive reading on the presidential tour of Gifford Lecture that had been given. Whitehead's Process Reality, Quest for Certainty of Dewey, of course, Nature and Destiny of Niebuhr, Gabriel Marcel's magnificent lectures, and Boltzmann's lectures on eschatology. Just went on and on. And all of them weren't worth reading. Don't get me wrong. I mean, McIntyre's were magnificent. I loved Stanley Howard's, and of course, I thoroughly loved Jeff Stout. I dedicated my lecture to my beloved wife, Anahita, who you just met, and Jeffrey Stout. That's probably one of the rare actions. He just gave the Gifford Lecture 7 years ago. He dedicated his to me and a friend. I give it 7 years later. I dedicate it to him and my wife. That's probably a rare. It really is. And we've had offices next to each other in Princeton many years before I left Princeton, went to Union in Harvard. So that it's again a blessing. It's almost a historical accident that we two brothers would be so tied together through love and respect, and both give the Gifford Lectures within 7 years of each other. Very much so. But you're right about those three Ks, though, brother. And it means so much to me to be honest about my own sense of vocation that has these deep Christian roots and, and,
Yeah,
and, and dimensions.
yeah. There in that section where you're engaging Max Weber in the sense of vocation versus a career, you talk
Right.
about the ethics of conviction versus the ethics of responsibility. I wonder if you could kind of help us see what you were doing with that contrast.
Yeah, we're building on Weber's distinction because for him, of course, the ethics of responsibility has to do with compromise. It has to do with prudentia, which is prudence, which is not the same as opportunism. It's not the same as just saying and doing anything you want. This is what you get with Trump and company these days. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, Brother Trump, in some ways, is a embodiment of Thrasymachus and Callicles. He's an embodiment of a kind of wholesale opportunism to say and do anything with no accountability, no responsibility whatsoever. And for Weber, Weber begins with nihilism. He was obsessed with Dostoevsky. A lot of people don't know that. He actually wrote a little fiction responding to Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. It's fascinating. And you see, he talks about Tolstoy primarily in the lectures, but it's Fyodor who really is pushing him against the wall. And so when he talks about ethics of conviction versus ethical responsibility, responsibility is in the mix of various forms of political power being contested. And ethics of conviction are Tolstoy's and others who have a moralistic conception of the world and hold on to absolute principles no matter what. That's the Philip Berrigans, the Daniel Berrigans, the Dorothy Days. We go on and on. And of course, the world is full of a lot of different kind of folk. So you're gonna have some absolutists, you're gonna have some contextualists, you're gonna have some relativists, you're gonna have some nihilists. And everybody's who they are and not somebody else. Samuel Butler's right about it. You just got to get used to the fact that you have a lot of different kind of people, and you have to be true to yourself. Where's your integrity? Where's your honesty? Where's your decency? Where's your love? Connected to your tradition and your family and your community and so forth. And you're going to run into a whole lot of other folk to learn from and also have to fight. I was interesting. I was with my dear brother Tavis Smiley. I'm on his radio show every Monday and Thursday, 10 o'clock, the second hour. We did a thing with Sean Hannity. And and Sean is so funny. I told Sean, I said, brother, I said that, you're always my brother because you made in the image of God. You have a certain dignity and sanctity that the world didn't give me and the world can't take away. But you are my enemy. And he jumps. Oh, Brother West, how can you say that? Well, oh, wow, all of the different dialogues we've had, and we've always had fights and so forth. I said, brother, you've always been my enemy and my foe. He said, but I thought I was your brother in Christ. I said, yes, you're that too. You are my brother in Christ. But you're my enemy because you're crushing the people I love. He said, oh, I said the same thing to the cowardly white supremacists there in Charlottesville a few years ago. They looked at me. You're that brother on television, all calling everybody brother. I can't stand that Nigger. I say, really, brother? And he jumps again. I say, brother, I'm a free Christian. I'm a free black man. I don't ask for anybody's permission as to who I love. I've been commanded by Jesus to love friend, foe, and enemy. I say, God loves you and God loves me. You choose to be a gangster. I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and now I'm a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. So you and your friends ought to be praying for me because I'm praying for you. But it's not going to break the brotherhood, even as you are my foe and enemy. But I'm told to love my enemy. Oh, man. And the brother was right next to him, just grabbed him. Oh, wait, quit talking to him. Quit talking to him. And the irony, brother, was, I'm just saying to you now, brother, the irony, my brother Trip, was they listening to Motown in the park before they marched to crush black people. Now, isn't that America right there? Stevie Wonder is playing for them with all of his love potions and stuff, because he's a love warrior at the highest level of artistic genius, right? And you say to yourself, how you gonna listen to Stevie and then put on your gear with your guns and talk about you want to crush these black people and crush these Jews? And it used to say they used to want to crush Catholics. I ran into David Duke when I was there, and of course he's Catholic. And I said, "Ooh, this is upward mobility, American style. Now you got Catholic head of the Klan, at least one of the big branches. Isn't that something? Someday you're gonna might have a Jew and a black brother head of the Klan. Oh, only in America. Well, we are all very, very wretched as well as wonderful human beings, creatures made in the image of a God, but we've used our freedom in such vicious and atrocious ways.
I'm interested in your in how you kind of process or analyze or think about uh, what are the what are the kind of variables that set up like our current situation where the first president who doesn't even think he should feign an uneasy conscience is the most fervently supported president for a large part of white Christianity, right? Like you and I would have had similar problems with George W. Bush.
That's true.
But I never worried that he actually lost sleep worrying about his decision. He had bad information. He was embarrassed and covered stuff up. There are tons of things about him that make me think he's on the same war criminal list as plenty of other people that have ran the military-industrial complex in our nation and done horrible things that I feel connected to because I paid taxes and are a part of this nation and such. But he feigned having a conscience, and he saved millions of lives in Africa by getting Jesse Helms and company to start funding things that Donald Trump's just unfunded. People with HIV/AIDS all over Africa. Our mutual friend Paul, who first connected us, in text message, his wife lives with HIV, and they work in Africa with people that a lot of that USAID funding helped give a life to, and we just cut it for no freaking reason.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you think, like as a political philosopher, when you see a group of people who don't even want a hypocrite anymore, but someone who the deep universal humanistic ideal of Christianity and its gift to the West, or the idea that how you care for the least of these is revelatory of who you are when we aren't looking, right? The commitment to democracy as a project and not just the power you can wield for your own team. None of that exists within him, and he makes fun of people in his own party who thought it was a good idea. And the most faithful followers have the same name after who is your Savior and Lord as me and you. And it remains dumbfounding, and I can just imagine it like being, there's lots of different causal factors people could try to point to, but in your conversations and relationships with people across so many different parts of the spectrum, what have you learned in an attempt to answer the why question?
Boy, that's a tough one, brother. I'm glad you invoked Brother Paul. He's such a wonderful. But you talking about the brother in Kenya?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's such a wonderful brother. He and his beloved family teach me so much about forms of repression and resistance going on there and so on. But I don't really have a definitive answer to your profound question, though, brother. I really, really don't. I think it has something to do with the fact that for so long, the dominant choices in the culture has been between a milquetoast neoliberalism and a conservatism. Bush called it compassionate, various varieties of conservatism. But once the neoliberalism completely collapsed and people were eager for something else, they saw through the hypocrisy, they saw through the imperial carnage that you got 500,000 people killed in Iraq under Democrats as well as, and nobody says a mumbling word. We can go on and on about that. Uh, there was no there was no strong alternative available to a lot of people because those of us on the left were unable to provide infrastructure, unable to provide visions that were accessible. I mean, when I ran for president, that's very much what I tried to do. Let's keep alive the bloodstained banner of the legacy of Martin King and Fannie Lou Hamer and Rabbi Heschel and company. That's what it was all about, right? But I mean, it was very little accessibility, very little possibility of people gaining access to it, hearing it, and so on. Whereas, the mainstream media, you had Trump's speeches, played day after day after day, going back to 2016. And so, on the one hand, it's a sign of just outright spiritual decay. Or moral decrepitude. Let's just be honest about it. But on the other hand, you have so many people who themselves had toyed with supporting, let's say, a Bernie Sanders, or many had voted for Obama. And of course, Obama's war crimes are not to be pushed aside either. I know you would be one of the first to acknowledge that as well. But he's not a fascist in the way that Trump is. He's not a gangster in the same way that Trump is, because at least he feigns some kind of moral conscience. Trump completely, undercuts La Rochelle Foucault's wonderful statement about hypocrisy is a tribute that vice plays to virtue. So that at least a hypocrite says, I know what virtue is, but I'm not going to move in that direction. I'm not going to choose it. I'm choosing vice. Where the gangster says, I don't give a damn. Virtue and vice to me are just empty categories. I do what I want to do. It is the most vulgar and crude form of will to power, right back to Thrasymachus, right back to Callicles in Plato's dialogues. But in terms of this particular historical moment for the American empire, I think that part of it we know has something to do with the sense that what has been in place is being undercut. And so it's easier to scapegoat the most vulnerable rather than confront the most powerful. So you zero in on the vulnerable migrants and immigrants trying to make their way into the country. The attacks on DEI and so forth, whatever excesses were in place, that becomes a way of allowing the white supremacist sensibilities to now have permission and to overflow and to grow and to continue on and on and on. Same is true with the attacks on women and male supremacy. And what is it now? I just saw that the Brother Wilson's got his church now right in Washington, D.C. He's come all the way from Moscow, Idaho now, right? He's saying, oh, I want to be right close to the White House. What do you want, Brother Wilson? What has the Lord told you? Well, I want a Christian nation with these women subordinated. I want a Christian nation where all of these non-Christians must defer to what we're about, because this is the only way we're going to hold on to the greatness of our country. Well, you see, it's for this is one of the deeply, deeply, not just right wing, but neo-fascist ideologies. Now he says he's not fascist at all; he's Christian. Well, okay, that's okay.
Yeah.
All right, we'd have to really debate what Christian is. It's hard to believe that Jesus would be a card carrying member of your church, though, brother. I don't know whether he would be able to get through the doors when he comes back, but that's a different question, because that's true for most churches in the country when it comes to Jesus coming back. But my point is that there's so many different factors. There's crucial economic factors in terms of the losers of corporate globalization, many of whom are Trump's followers, some of whom supported my dear brother Bernie. Bernie couldn't follow through in terms of making the breakthrough because the neoliberals under Obama came out to snuff him out. They would rather have Trump than Bernie, which is sick, I think.
Oh, you see it now with the response to Zoran in New York, where
That's
apparently
true.
vote blue no matter who stops the moment somebody tells the truth about neoliberalism
That's exactly
and
right.
the gospel it's been preaching.
That's
Um,
exactly
do you,
right.
so here's a connection point of that to what you were doing in the Giffords that
Hmm.
I'm kind of interested in. In part of what you're saying there is that the live political options in Americans' political imaginary have gotten so narrow that everything that was assumed were neoliberal expressions of it.
Right.
And the savior of neoliberalism is the right accountant. It's like the right way of organizing the numbers and thinking through this logically and structuring thing. We got an engineer who can bring salvation. And when then and the other element that kind of rationality generates is both that disenchantment bit that you bring up with Weber and that repression of catastrophe, right? A neoliberal only has problems they can fix and manage with the tools that they have mastered, not a catastrophe we have to make space for to know how to go forward. And I wonder if that's not a place where that introduction of blues and jazz and swing, maybe the swing bit in the series isn't helpful, because you had this aside that I hope in the printed version gets even more time, of the connection of Max Weber's definition of disenchantment and the logic of rationalizations and intellectualization sets up this disenchanted world. You contrast it or push back to it with jazz as a source of re-enchantment, and the jazz traditions as kind of the speaker for the lives in whom the story of disenchantment never found traction. And when we think of that political imagination that goes, here's two versions of neoliberalism that have an equal commitment to Israel, the military-industrial complex, multinational companies, ignoring the impact labor law and how it hurts people at home, impoverishes people in the present, and undermines national stakeholding in other countries in the global south. Like, there's so many things that are just all written in both boxes that I wonder if that's like that pushback towards disenchantment with jazz and improv is a place where your kind of political philosophy invites us to move beyond the kind of creeping nihilism of a buffet of neoliberally salted turds.
No, I'm telling you, brother, you on it. You on. I guess you at your A game all the time, but I you certainly hit the A game with
Well,
me
you gave
because
the
these
lectures
questions
years
are fun.
a year ago or so, and I rewatched them all last night. Well, like over the last few days, and just kept taking notes. So I have 23 pages of random stuff that popped in my
Man, well, I appreciate that though, brother. I really do. I know life is short for you to take that kind of time again, because that's 6 long lectures, and we had questions and everything else. I'll say this: that when I listen to someone like Harold Bloom, whom I have tremendous respect for, whatever criticisms I have, and he says over and over again that he thinks jazz is one of the greatest contributions of the American empire to the world. Or when I listen to a David Henry, David Bentley Hart talk about jazz and baseball. What do they mean when they say that? People think it's just a kind of flippant remark. No, no, these are very serious thinkers, and they know jazz doesn't drop down from heaven. They have a historical consciousness and a cultural sensibility. They know that it comes out of a community that has been wrestling with forms of catastrophe, but not allow catastrophe to have the last word. They know that black community has disproportionately fallen in love with a Palestinian Jew named Jesus, who has taught them to be pilgrims on earth and citizens of something beyond this earth, and yet not be escapists and yet not be illusionists, but engage the world in all of its ugliness, to get up every day and look at the ugliness of the world and still have the capacity to try to produce, be a part of something true and beautiful and good. And so jazz, in that sense, becomes a launching pad, not a foundational uh, project in the epistemological sense of certainty, but a launching pad, or at least a brook of fire through which one must pass, or at least a set of lens through which you look at the world and you feel things about the world and you try to act in relation to where you are in the world. That's what we're talking about jazz. So when you talked about the three elements that I invoked from Winton about blues and swing and catastrophe, and that catastrophe lyrically expressed and honestly encountered and artistically transfigured, which is what blues in so many ways is. And that's Ralph Ellison, that's Albert Murray. We can go on and on. Toni Morrison and others who's reflected on this. And then swing with that note of dissonance. You know, when Ellington says black people make dissonance a way of life. So that's the black keys with the flats and the sharps and so forth, not being able to fit in. So you in but not of. Now we know theologically that can lead toward our own scripture, but existentially and culturally it can lead toward against the grain, but recognizing you're learning something from the very thing you're going against. Very important. Never just a parasite on a host, but viewing the context in which you find yourself as part of the conversation, but not trumping the conversation. Well, I guess I can't use that word no more with Brother Trump, but
it does make it
truncating,
uncomfortable.
truncating the conversation or foreclosing certain kinds of options, even when they only freedom dreams. I mean, you think about it, you know. Frederick Douglass got to choose between two slaveholders if, in fact, he can even be a free man to vote when he escapes from slavery. Well, you got to form your own party, a liberty party. Who you going to work with? Well, we got some abolitionists around. How many abolitionists you got? Very small group. Most Christians are tied into conformity with the barbarity of slavery at that time, right? Vast majority are. William Lloyd Garrison, what you got to do? We got some folk. Elijah Lovejoy coming out of Princeton Seminary. I've got to opt for the abolitionists. Dead man soon. Dies right there in outside of St. Louis. Tremendous risk for folk who are willing to pursue the truth in a jazz-like, blues-like, catastrophic soaked way. And so you've got catastrophe, you got swing, then you got improvisation as a species of practical wisdom. Uh, uh, and in many ways, you know, that's probably the best we can do. I use, as you recall, Eugene O'Neill in the lecture on America, because that Iceman cometh, brother. He says human beings would choose greed over liberty each and every day. He says, so all the talk about liberty in America, of course, it has some impact, it has some consequences, but in the end, when the choice is between greed and liberty, they will let liberty go in a minute. And he says, that's not just an American choice, that's a human choice. That's an Irish brother shaped by Catholic sensibility, even though he's thoroughly secular and an anarchist too. But that play of his was probably the greatest indictment of the American empire ever performed on the stage. And it's very much about, again, something very basic: greed, hatred, fear, envy, resentment, those things that are constant in the human story. Every society that we know takes different forms, articulated in different ways, but it's always already there and will always be there, my brother. Because we know when we're honest, we got greed inside of us, we got hatred inside of us, envy, resentment, fear inside of us. And what does the gospel tell us? Do not be afraid. Love enemy, love thy neighbor. Be a blessing, be a neighbor to the neighbor and the enemy. And the enemy is not static. The enemy can change. The enemy can be transformed, can be converted. so that there's always a potential there, even given the wretchedness which is never ever to be denied. Human wretchedness is probably one of the most verified and verifiable of realities that we know in human archives.
That clarity about both as individuals and as collectives our brokenness is, in an odd way, a unique gift Christianity gets to give the left in general. One of my favorite interviews with you was the last time you and Michael Brooks talked before he passed
Oh
away.
yeah, brother Michael Brooks. Oh, I love my brother. We miss Michael Brooks, man.
Yes.
We miss
and
Michael Brooks.
and I think he named the need for the left in America. His line was to find a soul or a spirit,
Mm,
without a kind of requiring some like homogenous religion or something. And you'd heard his own wrestling with Western religious traditions and Eastern ones, and in that
right.
conversation, he was going on trying to talk about the human condition, and you said, and I get a shorthand that everyone else on the left doesn't always get. It's called sinner. And I get to use it because it's truth telling, and I know I'm talking about myself at the same time. And it was a beautiful conversation about like the need that those who are increasingly aware of the systemic catastrophes that we're facing also need an awareness, of that gangster-like narrative running through each one of us that we're hopefully in recovery from.
No, that's very
And
real.
so
That's
and
very
so I wonder how you see the for a lot of the people listening, there's going to be a lot of more progressive Christian clergy or kind of post-Christian people or academics and such. Like, what does it mean to be a steward of a tradition that still has the category sinner while being invested in politics and organizing where our partners may not share the wisdom tradition we're in? How do we kind of, as you've done, I think, really well throughout your career, is get to be yourself who can't tell their story without Shiloh Baptist and Jesus Cross, but you also can't live in a world without, while ignoring the pain and unjust suffering of children here or in Palestine or in Rwanda.
that's true. Well, I think first thing though is always, cut back any form of Christian self-righteousness. I have a cruciform and Christocentric conception of life and history that I think is true. But I recognize, I can read Sophocles and have a deep sense of the brokenness of the world without any reference to Christian faith, Christian ways of life. Or I can read Freud, who's even more pessimistic in some ways than some of our Calvinistic brothers and sisters in terms of capacity of human beings to ever do anything right. We just so tribal and narcissistic. We don't have any sense of internationalism or universalism, and we're locked into just trying to make some major move from outright neurosis to normal unhappiness. I mean, if Freud, you can get to normal unhappiness in Freud, you really hit the bullseye because he's got a very bleak conception, as you know, beyond the pleasure principle of civilization is discontents, the future of an illusion, all of those classics of his. And he doesn't
The
need
discontents run deep.
yeah, exactly. He doesn't need we Christians for that. But I do think that we just have to be bold, though, brother. We have to be bold. We have to talk about sin. We got to talk about being sinners. We have to talk about sinfulness, and we have to do it in such a way that is truthful, and therefore it always leaves the possibility for breakthrough, for transformation, for metamorphosis, for conversion. And we have examples. I mean, we got clouds of witnesses that we forever point to. See, Francis of Assisi, Catholic brothers and sisters have no monopoly on Francis. We Baptists got Francis too. In fact, the world has him, but Christians across the board have him in that regard. You know what I mean? There can be towering figures in the Eastern Orthodox tradition that exemplify levels of love that become part and parcel of our cloud of witnesses. I mean, I invoke Martin King all the time because he just means so much to me, growing up and continually to this very day. But he's not alone as well. But that cloud of witnesses, of course, usually are cruciform in the generic sense. misunderstood, character assassination, literal assassination, executed, excommunicated. We can go right down the line. When you can put praise of folly on your index of prohibited books, and I love my Catholic brothers and sisters, but come on now, Erasmus, the greatest public intellectual of European modernity, early, middle, or late, and his classics are put on the index of prohibited books. You know you got to have a conception of sin and a conception of blindness that cuts very deep. Now, of course, they did take it off too, so you got to give them credit. We want to acknowledge that very much so. But you are so right about being willing to speak honestly about the brokenness of the world without that brokenness being used as a rationalization of either doing nothing or just caving in and just conforming to whatever status quo is in place. And that's one of the great joys, really, of trying to pursue the Christian way of life. That it really is one that embraces whatever challenges, historicity, concreticity in terms of lived experiences, catastrophes in history, moments of ecstasies in history, joys of community, joys of relationship, and of course, death in its physical sense, staring one in the face. And how do you come to terms with the unavoidable and inescapable physical death? Is it a period or a comma? These kinds of issues you continually refuse to deny. You wrestle with it until the end. No easy answers. In fact, no answers in the abstract. You live the questions the way Rilke talked about it. You live the questions, and yet you do feel as if you have access to something very real in terms of a spirit, of a power, almost a kind of pneumatology more than an epistemology, though the two are not over against each other in order to deal with whatever limitation that we have as human creatures.
Yeah, one of the questions that I get in emails from clergy pretty regularly are ones that are trying to negotiate how they articulate prophetic challenge in the present or honesty about brokenness when you have congregations that have more time being indoctrinated by an algorithm outside of the worshiping life of the church or the gift of scripture and prayer and these kind of things. They're having a congregation who the algorithm is possessing their imagination and then showing up in a worship service where so many of them feel trapped by something they have so little agency over. And then it's like, what do you do? Right. And I had a Episcopal priest say, at what point, like when you look back at the history, say in America, at some point there are only 3 or 4 abolitionists. And then someone said, I don't think the solution to this is making sure that feeding works well, or, that slaves get nice houses, right? Like we're trying to reform a thing.
That's right.
It's just wrong.
That's right.
And this is wrong. Right. And the tendency then dealing with Jim Crow, thinking of like Letter to the Birmingham Jail, and in the present, for a lot of the church that is predominantly white or predominantly middle class, is this mushy, moderate, vague for those that are listening clarity, and not something forward. And so I wonder what kind of how would you help those stewarding the Christian tradition in that situation think about their vocation to the gospel and to their community when knowing when and how and how to shape their voice in relationship to the catastrophic?
Yeah, I think part of it, though, again, is at the existential level in terms of one's own calling. What would I do? How do I become an example of one who could provide some illumination for persons who are wrestling with those contexts and doing the kind of things you're doing? That's the first thing. So you want to be a part of whatever group, whatever cloud of witnesses in order for people to be able to see something different and feel something deeper and be exposed to more courageous witness. Even though every form of courageous witness, has its own blindnesses. Splinter in one's eye is the biggest magnifying glass, says Adorno, and I think he's right. In addition, though, the question becomes, how do you get to the leadership? And this is where teaching in the seminary, I've been blessed, as you know, to teach Union Seminary for many, many years. I started in 1977, from Don Shriver to Serene Jones as president. So I've been very, very blessed. I've been in other places in between. But to try to have impact on a leadership that would encourage those leaders and pastors to continually be courageous enough to keep alive and make the bread of life fresh rather than just to conform it to the coldness and the callousness of the world. Because keep in mind, none of us are Messiah, so all our calling is just to bear witness, man. Eliot says ours is in the trying, the rest is not our business in that sense. Because if we think we've got to get full control, we're on our way to the crack house. I mean, you're gonna snap, you're gonna go crazy, especially if you're highly sensitive. If you like an orange without a peel, and all the suffering in the world, you won't be able to make it. You just be completely undercut and undermined, precisely because you're so hypersensitive. So that you have to be able to sustain yourself and to do it in such a way that we're not messianic. We know we don't have these grand powers of changing. I mean, if I could bring a close to genocide right now in Gaza and in Sudan, God, I would have done that a long time ago. I pray every night, but I mean, the prayers themselves are not just petitions, but they're expressions of a certain kind of love in my conversation with God. But it's not something to be answered overnight because you got human will that's mediating so many of these things. And a lot of that human will is going toward greed and hatred and subjugation. So that, in the end, and this is where history plays an important role, that you read the section of Praise and Folly by Erasmus and his critique of the professionals, be they pastors, clergy, intellectuals, lawyers, doctors. You remember, it's as if he could have written it last night. The levels of pettiness and conformity and complacency and cowardliness. Look at the universities. All of our talk in the universities about the true and the good and the beautiful. As soon as a gangster named Trump goes after them, what do? Bow down, kiss his ring. My God, you've been teaching Socrates and Voltaire, all of these towering figures, and that's what you end up doing. Yes, because we're concerned about money, reputation. We're afraid. Oh, I see. Similarly, so in our churches, not just our churches, our mosque, our synagogues. Where are they prophetic in the best sense? Each one has a cloud of witnesses. Prophetic Judaism, prophetic Islam, prophetic Christianity, prophetic secular university, and so forth. But generally speaking, brother, Samuel Beckett's got a point. Beckett's got a point. The tears of the world are constant. And you see the levels of cowardliness and complacency enacted over and over and over again, tied to the lies and crimes and the follies. And yet we must never, ever be discouraged. We must be encouraged of great courage tied to compassion. And that's one reason why, somebody like yourself, though, brother, who's full of this magnificent Christian spirit that you have. It's tied to a humor, reminds me of Gilbert Keith Chesterton and the mirth of Christ. You got a wonderful sense of humor that humanizes. That's crucial because it helps create human connection, humane connection, and community. But the bleakness is always there too. But I know the bleakness has to be inside of you. So how do you deal with it, though, brother? How do you deal with that bleakness?
I I mean, it's something you even mentioned earlier in your story with Hannity about, oh well, you are my enemy, and he was shocked because he thought that if you're an enemy, then that changes the way I relate to you. And that would mean like you wouldn't respect him, and you would be dismissive, or you wouldn't listen. As opposed to when I take the time to get to know my enemies, my dispositions change to them, because now I'm obligated to pray for them. And knowing that, the last year I did this audio documentary on Bonhoeffer, and one of the passages that stuck out to me, and that had never really been there before, in his letter after 10 years, right before he gets arrested, and he has this section on contempt for humanity, and that the German Christian church should have been, the confessing church fell, the German Christian church group wins. You got like make Germany great again energy running all over the place, and he says that his temptation, the deepest temptation, is to hold those brothers and sisters in contempt. But while he was still a sinner, Christ gave himself for him, and it's true about his enemy. And so for me, part of one of the gifts the Christian faith has given me for thinking about these times is the permission to be honest about the parts of me I don't like about myself, the places that growth is demanded and required and stuff, and be able to tell the truth because you're in a context of grace. And that also ends up playing out that we get to tell the truth in the context of grace, even with our enemies. And when they don't have the power to shake off their own God-belovedness, even though they deny the humanity of people around them, and we get to testify to it, that to me is celebratory. You mentioned earlier being in conversation with people who've looked at the story of the gospel in this beautiful sense. I mean, like, that's so beautiful. I couldn't believe that.
Yeah.
And I have this sense of, it's so beautiful, it should be true. And I think that Kierkegaardian sense of faith is one of the gifts he's given me is, historical consciousness. Throw on everything we've learned in the Enlightenment. You're never going to have certainty about anything. But the one thing you do get to do is decide what to do with your finitude. And as, a Baptist preacher's kid in the South, and then had my discovering postmodern philosophy and stuff in undergrad and figuring all that out, I was sitting there fasting during Holy Week, reading Jesus on the cross, and he said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And I thought, well, if there was an ultimate reality, it should be a loving parent, where every child carries a dignity no finite being can question. And but at least the second half I know is true, that we have no idea what the hell we're doing. So if something's going to be true, it should be that beautiful.
I know
one where that's what gets spoken.
Real. That's
and
real.
that kind of beauty is one that when you like in the lecture series where you talk about the kind of like growing temptation of nihilism and stuff, that kind of beauty generates like the ability to sing an honest blue note, or to swing the situation where that myopic time opens up, and that the kind of inversions that happen with improvisation, and it's precisely the groundedness of the tradition that creates the playfulness.
Yeah.
And so I remember sitting there going, I don't know, but I know following after the crucified one is a life worth living. Mm-hmm. And the world could do with communities across the entire planet who wake up at least once or twice a year and think, I want the same mind to be in me that was in the one who humbled himself, who took the form of a servant, even to death on a cross.
Absolutely.
And when we think of like the challenge of the ecological crisis that you rage, the way in which all the neoliberal economic system continues to commodify our lives and our neighbors, to turn the nature into natural resources and people into human resources. Like what are the spaces and places, rhythms and such that call us into the fullness of our humanity and insist that every beauty you've discovered in your own self exists even in your enemy?
Or at least potentially. Yeah. Exactly.
Or that they're the site of the coming of the kingdom of God as well. That to me is worth giving yourself to and figuring out exactly where our is one of the only times I know Wolfhart Pannenberg mentioned that he might change his mind was not knowing at what point in his systematic theology his internally rational reflection lapses into doxology. Right? Like he's got a beautiful complete. He's like, I think I'm right, but I don't know when it lapses into doxology.
Yep.
But it's all the, which I think is halfway through volume 2. But the doxology is a part of his piety, right? Like
It's
thinking
got to
through
be.
the Christ event.
That's
And
exactly right. It's got
that's
to
one of the
be.
reasons I loved your lectures, because it was like the people who formed your life and all that kind of stuff's there. The story, the Jesus story that you can't shake, and it's your wrestling with your inheritance without muting the catastrophe of existence. And I could think of that same provocation to our friends that write systematic theologies. What would be a jazz soak theology for a catastrophic time? And how does that change our theological method? I know you would probably start with Holy Saturday and not Easter Sunday.
That's right. All the time.
And
You start with that nihilism and with the possibility of misanthropy.
oh yeah,
That possibility of where Mark Twain ended up, or where Jonathan Swift tended to end up, where just the hatred of humanity proceeds from the acknowledgement of the overwhelming wretchedness of humanity. You can understand why people make that move. You just refuse to make it. But I do think, though, that there's something distinctively USA and American about this talk about where you and I end up as Christians, which is the obsession with experience from Jonathan Edwards all the way through Emerson and William James and others. And part of our holding on is just like the love you have for Alicia. So you don't give a dang what the world says or does. You have experienced something with that sister that blew your mind and continues to blow it. Your relation with your 3 kids. You don't care what the rest of the world says. They have blown your mind. They have introduced miracles in your mind, which is almost like a walking on water, but is as natural as the birth that Alicia gave to the 3 kids. So that appeal to experience you, and that's jazz like, right? That you have experienced something, and it's always through a set of lens. We know, we understand that language mediates it. We're conscient enough to know that it's not direct, immediate access to any ding Anzik any reality. We understand how complicated these constructions can be, but it's still experience. And when you have experienced a relationship with Jesus, then that's the lens through which you're going to view things, because you're thoroughly convinced that no other interpretation, explanation, description, conceptualization makes sense other than this genuine relation you have with a power bigger than you and a grace that you receive, and the change and transformation you have observed in your own life prior to your acceptance. Now that goes hand in hand, I think, with all the other stuff too.
yeah. I think that like thinking of those very particular things, like each person's particular beloveds. One of the gifts I think that like the philosophical vision can help us do, or our theological framing can do, is to go, you like there's something so particular about the narrative of you and your beloved.
That's right.
But there's also something so resonant that we call love between each person and their beloved. And I think a lot of times people in different religious traditions feel like they have to have our beloved in the exact same way we have it,
Right.
as opposed
That's right.
to like if I told you stories about Alicia and I's relationship, you would start to think of unique things about yours, and
Right.
other people would be listening to us talk and they think about theirs, and that doesn't mean we're handing out our partner's phone numbers. It means that we recognize that in that bond of those beloveds, love resides,
That's it.
and it means you don't have to be anxious about the reality of love while being precious with the particularities, of it and how it shows up in your own life.
That's exactly right. And it gives you that kind of armor that, Conrad has a kind of honorable stoicism because he doesn't have Jesus, he doesn't have religious backdrop, but he's got this sense of calmness and serenity in the face of overwhelming flood and catastrophe and storm. You say, Joseph Conrad, where do you get that from? Well, I am a Stoic, that I have forged an armor to come to terms with anything that will undercut me or overwhelm me. And I think that Christians need a stroke of a certain kind of honorable stoicism that's tied to the blood at the cross, which is to say that you're not going to be overwhelmed. You're not going to be completely undercut. You're not going to find yourself in a panic, overwhelmed by anxiety and so. No, you have an armor that equips you to come to terms with whatever it is, spiritual wickedness in high places, low places, whatever it is, lies, crimes, and so forth, because you have certain kinds of experiences that you have accepted that are real to you that the world didn't give you and the world can't take away. They can send you to jail, or as what the first out of the first 35 popes of the Catholic Church, 31 of them were executed. You can go to your death like Thomas More in the Tower of London in 1535. Hey, where you get that kind of strength? Bonhoeffer, what does he say? This is the end, but it's the beginning for me. Last words before he's executed. Dietrich, where you get that kind of armor from? Oh, I've been on a bumpy road. I might not be John Bunyan, but I've been on a bumpy road, and my pilgrimage is one that is led toward Harlem, Abyssinian Church, Union Seminary, Spain, London, Nazi Germany, and I am one who still believes that Jesus is with me even until the end of the world. It's a beautiful way to be, brother.
Yeah, I feel like someone from the choir is going to ask you a question. Where can you go to escape the love of God in Christ Jesus? It's it's one of those that whole setup. I think is one of those passages in Romans where Paul's like, well, even down all the way to Sheol, nope. And then when we reflect on it, we tell the stories of those who have come before us, and so it's not just Paul. It's a whole bunch of popes all the way to Bonhoeffer, and you just start going through the list of people of faith, and their testimony, I think, is really a form of encouragement. And one of the things I mean, in your own life and the way in which you brought in the gift of blues and swing and jazz to what is the got to be one of the generally most tame philosophical conversations of the Giffords was beautiful, because it allowed telling stories and songs of those testimonies into a lecture series about natural philosophy that had never been there before.
Natural philosophy and natural theology. No, you're right,
Yeah.
though, because the Giffords been around about 188 years or so, and they've had some magnificent lectures and so forth. But I just wanted to be true to my own vocation and calling, true to my own spiritual formation, and true to my own sense of both integrity as well as fallibility. And I had a good time. The thing about jazz soak is you got to find joy in it, man. You can't. It's hard to be a Christian and never exemplify joy and love. I mean, a lot of times you see Christians so down and out and serious and solemn, with no mirth and no funk and no fun at all. And people say, dang, you got a fascinating intellectual understanding of Christianity, but is your Christian life a little bit more than just these conceptualizations? I hope so. That's where the doxology has to be shot through all the other forms, be it fundamental theology or practical theology or systematic theology or whatever. Where's the joy? You can't be a Christian and walk around and have no joy. Where's the love? You can't be a Christian and not just rejoice and try to embrace folk and try to ensure that the love that you have received is something that you're able to touch others in the best of your ability, not because you're just into uplifting others, but the joy in you means you're a chronic uplifter, you're a chronic endorser, you're a chronic empower, you're a chronic healer. How come? Because Jesus healed me, empowered me. And if you're not a Christian, it's still a good way of being in the world. Anyway, because a lot of non-Christians have magnificent joy, magnificent love. That's a beautiful thing. Absolutely. But when you talked about hatred of humanity, I mean, you remember the great Herschel when he walked over to Union Seminary in 1965 and gave the first lecture of a non-Christian in that context called No Religion is an Island, calling for ecumenical consciousness of Jews and Christians and even Muslims. What did he say? The biggest ecumenical movement in the world is nihilism. He said, we better get together because nihilism's taking over. That's 65. And we know the intimate relation between nihilism and fascism. Here we are, 2025, 60 years later. What are the major tendencies right now on the globe? Fascism, nihilism, Thrasymachus, Callicles, might makes right where we started. And Trump becomes just one exhibition alongside a whole host of others in Latin America and in Africa and in Asia and the Middle East and so forth and so on. We won't mention all the names because we already know them. So in that sense, and I know we got to bring this to an end though, brother, but I can say this, man, you have given me great love and joy in this dialogue, in this interview, man. This has been marvelous though, brother.
Oh,
Magnificent.
it's been a blast. It's been a blast. And um, okay, I have one last question for you.
Sure.
It's a fun one. All right, you name dropped so many different musicians and songs throughout the lecture series. So when the book's released, the nice edited versions released, and your publisher does what any reasonable one would do and ask you to create a Spotify playlist so that people can play music when they come up in the references or play it in the background while they're reading. What are some of the songs that cannot be forgotten on the jazz-soaked philosophy for our Catastrophic Times playlist with Cornel West?
God Almighty, brother, that's a wonderful question. I don't think that it's been Gifford Lectures of people were asking for a song list to go along with that.
I just feel like the footnotes, you got to have an audio footnote.
I love it. Well, as you know, we ended with Love Supreme, though. That was more of a public utterance than it was musical expression. But Love Supreme would certainly be one. My favorite of Coltrane, After the Rain, would certainly be one. Round Midnight by Miles, written by Monk. But I would go off into Someday We'll All Be Free by Donny Hathaway. I see Love Ballad by LTD. Love in Search of Love by Stevie Wonder. Should it be The Love Train by the OJs? It would be something by the Dramatics, probably Welcome Back Home, because I think that the greatest art for me to come out of Europe was Rembrandt right before he died. That Prodigal Son, Return of the Prodigal Son. I've got 2 or 3 of those pictures on my wall, though, man. There's a musicality of Welcome Back Home and the Dramatics that remind me of that core. You remember, that's exactly to the biblical scripture that Dostoevsky read on his deathbed. Brought all of his kids together. He said, I've got something to read. What you gonna read, Fyodor? The Return of the Prodigal Son. Good God. Welcome Back Home. Dramatics is a way of acknowledging, almost like Hugh again of St. Victor, that no slice of land in the end is really our home for Christians. We're pilgrims, we're sojourners. Of course, we have a home in terms of home is where the heart is. So the mom and daddy and granddaddy and our beloved wives, Anahita, for you, Alicia, and so on, our home. But in the end, The home that we're talking about is not the home run that Hank Aaron hit. God bless him. But it's that place where our final fulfillment is found. And the great Augustine understood it well. It's in the bosom of that loving God who sacrificed God's self for we creatures to be forces for a kingdom that brings us a joy and a love in the midst of overwhelming catastrophe, but not exclusively exhausting the world. There's always something left over. Sometimes all it is just blood at the cross. The blood of love drops. And those love drops constitute ways at the back of a people who choose the Christian way of life, which is a Christian way of love, which is a Christian way of serving and sacrificing and looking for a Christian promise.
Yeah. Well, this has been a complete joy, and I really hope you have a nice playlist when the book comes out.
You got me thinking about that, my brother. You got me
it
thinking about that. I got a lot of thinking to do. You can see that. But thank you for everything, though. But
this has been magnificent. This has been wonderful.
Just wonderful for me, man. And God bless your loved ones, though, man. And any help, support I can ever be, you let me know. I'm telling you.